The stars burned cold in the observation window of the trading station above Kepler 442b. Commander Ilara Voss stood with her hands behind her back, watching the cargo ships move between the docking bays like slow-dancing fireflies. She had done this job 100 times before. Meet the aliens. Shake their strange hands or claws or tentacles. Sign the papers. Smile for the cameras. Go home today was supposed to be simple. The Gentar Concordat wanted to talk about mining rights in the outer systems. They were an insectoid species, all clicking mandibles and too many legs, but they seemed friendly enough. They had joined the Galactic Council only 5 years ago. They followed the rules. They paid their taxes. They did not cause trouble. Ilara checked her watch. The Gentar delegation would arrive in 20 minutes. She straightened her uniform and walked to the conference room. Her assistant, a young man named Marcus, was already setting up the holographic displays. He looked nervous. Marcus always looked nervous before meetings with aliens. Everything was normal. Everything was fine. Ilara had no way of knowing that in 3 hours her entire world would end. The meeting went well. The Gentar diplomats were polite. They spoke through translation devices that made their clicking sounds into smooth human words. They wanted access to 3 asteroid belts in the frontier zones. The asteroids had rare metals that the Gentar needed for their breeding colonies. Ilara saw no problem with this. The asteroids belonged to no one. The Gentar offered fair payment. She made a note to send the proposal to Earth for approval. Then her communicator beeped. It was an emergency signal. Ilara excused herself and stepped into the hallway. She answered the call. The face that appeared on her screen was pale and shaking. It was Admiral Chen from the defense station near New Terra. New Terra was the second largest human colony in the galaxy. 4.3 billion people lived there. Ilara had family there. Her brother, her sister-in-law, their 2 children. Admiral Chen did not waste time with greetings. His voice cracked as he spoke. A Gentar research station near New Terra had activated a weapon, not a normal weapon. A stellar lance. A device that could pierce the magnetic field of a star and trigger a premature supernova. The weapon had been hidden for years, built in secret, disguised as a simple science outpost. The Gentar had fired it at New Terra's sun. Ilara felt the floor tilt under her feet. She grabbed the wall to steady herself. This could not be real. This could not be happening. The Treaty of Sol had one law that every species in the galaxy followed. One law that could never be broken. No one was allowed to weaponize stars or create artificial black holes. No one. Ever. The punishment for breaking this law was total war. Every species agreed to this because stellar weapons could destroy entire solar systems. They could kill billions in hours, and the Gentar had just used one. Admiral Chen was still talking. The star was destabilizing. Solar radiation was increasing. New Terra had 16 hours before the surface became uninhabitable. Maybe less. The evacuation had already started, but there was not enough time. There were not enough ships. Not enough escape pods. Not enough anything. Ilara felt numb. She asked about her family. Admiral Chen looked away from the camera. He said he did not know. He said the communication networks were overloaded. He said millions of people were trying to call their loved ones all at once. She ended the call. Her hands were shaking. She walked back to the conference room in a daze. The Gentar diplomats were waiting for her, their compound eyes gleaming in the light. They looked pleased with themselves. Ilara realized with cold horror that they knew. They had known all along. This meeting was a distraction. Keep the human commander busy while their hidden weapon fired. One of the Gentar clicked its mandibles. The translator turned it into words. They said they regretted the action, but it was necessary. Humanity was expanding too fast. Human colonies were getting too close to Gentar breeding grounds. The Gentar needed those systems for their young. They had tried to negotiate, but humans did not listen. So they made a choice. One human world in exchange for peace. A proportional strike. A warning. Ilara stared at them. Proportional. They called the murder of 4 billion people proportional. They called breaking the one sacred law of galactic civilization a warning. She did not remember drawing her sidearm. She did not remember pointing it at the lead diplomat. Marcus grabbed her arm before she could fire. He was shouting something about courts and trials and justice. The words sounded hollow, empty. What justice could there be for 4 billion dead? Security arrived and took the Gentar into custody. They did not resist. They seemed almost bored. Ilara watched them go and she understood something terrible. They did not think they had done anything wrong. They truly believed this was reasonable. A calculated trade. Some human lives for Gentar security. The next 16 hours were hell. Ilara sat in her quarters and watched the news feeds. Thousands of ships fled from New Terra. They packed people into every available space. Cargo holds, engine rooms, anywhere with oxygen. The ships launched in waves, racing against time and radiation. But there were not enough ships. There would never be enough ships. The sun grew brighter, hotter. The radiation levels climbed. People on the surface began to die. First it was hundreds, then thousands, then millions. The feeds showed people in the streets looking up at the sky, knowing they would not escape. Some prayed, some screamed, some just held each other and waited for the end. Ilara tried to call her brother. The network was down. She tried again, and again, and again. The calls never went through. When the 16 hours ended, New Terra's sun exploded in a burst of radiation that sterilized the entire system. 890 million people died. The rest had escaped, but they were refugees now. Homeless, traumatized, forever changed. Ilara finally got through to her brother's emergency contact. It was a recorded message. He was dead. His wife was dead. Their children were dead. They had been waiting at a spaceport when the radiation wave hit. They never made it onto a ship. She sat in the dark of her quarters and cried. Then she stopped crying. Something cold and hard settled in her chest. Something that felt like ice and tasted like ash. The Gentar had broken the one law. They had killed nearly 1 billion humans, and they called it proportional. They called it necessary. Ilara stood up. She wiped her eyes. She put on her uniform. She walked to the command center and requested immediate transport to Earth. There would be a response to this. There had to be. And she wanted to be part of it. The galaxy was about to learn what happened when you made humanity angry. The Gentar had broken the one law that protected everyone from extinction. Now humanity would show them why that law existed in the first place. Earth was in chaos. Ilara arrived 3 days after New Terra died, and she could feel the anger in the air like electricity before a storm. The streets were filled with protesters. Some carried signs demanding war. Others held pictures of loved ones who had died. The news channels played the same footage over and over again. The dying star, the fleeing ships, the empty cities left behind. The refugee fleets had begun arriving at colonies across human space. Millions of people with nowhere to go. They had lost everything. Their homes, their possessions, their families. The colonies tried to help, but the numbers were overwhelming. There were not enough homes, not enough food, not enough jobs. Tent cities sprang up outside major population centers. People slept in warehouses and school gymnasiums and anywhere else with a roof. The Galactic Council called an emergency session. Representatives from dozens of species gathered to discuss what had happened. The Gentar sent their own delegation. They did not apologize. They explained their position calmly, as if they were discussing trade agreements instead of mass murder. Humanity was expanding into their territory. They had simply defended themselves. It was regrettable but necessary. Some alien species actually agreed with them. The reptilian score said that humanity had grown too powerful too quickly. The crystalline Vesh worried about human military buildup. Even some of the older species, ones who had been in the galaxy for thousands of years, suggested that perhaps the Gentar had a point. Perhaps humanity needed to be taught limits. The human representative demanded justice. The Gentar leadership must face trial. The entire Concordat must pay reparations. The stellar weapon must be dismantled and all research destroyed. The Galactic Council debated for hours. In the end, they offered a compromise. The Gentar would pay compensation. They would destroy the weapon. But their leaders would not face trial. The Gentar claimed cultural immunity. Their society did not allow outsiders to judge their hive queen. To do so would be to insult their entire species. The human representative rejected this immediately. No amount of money could replace 890 million lives. Justice meant holding the guilty accountable. But the Galactic Council would not budge. They were afraid. afraid of humanity, afraid of war. They wanted peace at any cost, even if that cost was human blood. On Earth, the Parliament met in closed session. The debates went on for 72 hours. Ilara watched from the gallery. She had been called to testify about what she had seen on the trading station. She told them about the Gentar diplomats, how they had known about the attack, how they had shown no remorse, how they had called it proportional. The moderates in Parliament argued for patience, work through the Galactic Council, apply economic pressure, isolate the Gentar diplomatically, give peace a chance. But every time they spoke, someone in the gallery would shout a name, a father, a daughter, a friend, someone who had died on New Terra, someone who would never come home. The hardliners wanted immediate military action. Crush the Gentar, make them pay in blood, show the galaxy that humanity could not be pushed around. They had broken the one law that kept everyone safe. They had murdered billions and called it reasonable. They deserved no mercy. In the end, the hardliners won. The vote was not even close. Parliament granted emergency wartime powers to Fleet Admiral Tarek Okonkwo. He was a legend in the military, a tactical genius who had fought in the border wars 20 years ago. He had also lost his wife on New Terra. She had been visiting her sister when the star died. Admiral Okonkwo's first act was to address the entire human empire. His speech was broadcast on every channel, every frequency, every network. He stood in his dress uniform, his face carved from stone, and spoke in a voice that did not shake. He said that the Gentar had declared war on humanity the moment they fired their weapon. They had broken the one law meant to prevent extinction-level warfare. They had killed nearly 1 billion innocent people. And they would pay. Humanity would respond, the Admiral said. Not with stellar weapons. Humanity would not break the law as the Gentar had, but they would respond with everything else, every ship, every soldier, every weapon in their arsenal. The Gentar wanted to see what happened when they broke the one law. Now they would see what happened when humanity stopped following any law at all. The speech ended with a promise. The Gentar Concordat would cease to exist. Their military would be destroyed. Their government would fall. Their people would learn what it meant to face human fury. It would not happen overnight. It would not be easy. But it would happen. This was not a threat. It was a guarantee. The galaxy watched in growing horror. Some species immediately closed their borders and declared neutrality. They wanted no part of what was coming. Others, like the Score, quietly began sending supplies to the Gentar. If humanity won this war, they might not stop with the Gentar. They might decide to punish everyone who had not stood with them. The military mobilization began immediately. Every shipyard in human space went to maximum production. Factories that had built civilian vessels retooled to make warships. Mining colonies worked around the clock to provide raw materials. Training academies graduated cadets early and sent them straight to the fleet. Admiral Okonkwo called Ilara to his office. She expected a routine assignment, maybe a posting to a logistics ship or a training facility. Instead, the Admiral offered her command of an experimental dreadnought. The ship was called the Righteous Fury. It was the newest and most powerful vessel in the human fleet, armed with weapons that had never been tested in real combat, protected by shields that could withstand a direct hit from a battlecruiser, fast enough to outrun most alien ships and strong enough to destroy anything it caught. Ilara was stunned. She was a mid-rank officer. She had never commanded anything larger than a patrol frigate. Why would the Admiral give her such an important ship? Okonkwo's answer was simple. He had read her file. He knew she had lost family on New Terra. He knew she had nearly killed the Gentar diplomats. He needed commanders who understood what this war was about. Commanders who would not hesitate. Commanders who would do whatever it took to win. Ilara accepted the command. She went to the shipyard where the Righteous Fury waited. The ship was enormous, sleek and dangerous looking, like a knife made of steel and fury. She walked through its corridors and met her crew. They were all volunteers. Every single one of them had lost someone on New Terra. A parent, a sibling, a friend. They all wore the same look in their eyes. the look of people who had nothing left to lose. That night, Ilara stood in the captain's quarters of her new ship. She looked out at the stars and thought about her brother, about his children, about all the people who had died because the Gentar decided their lives were worth less than breeding colonies. She thought about justice and revenge and wondered if there was any difference between them anymore. A message came through from the refugee camps, a recorded video. It showed a little girl, maybe 6 years old, lying in a hospital bed. She had been on one of the last ships to escape New Terra. She had survived, but her parents had not. The girl looked at the camera with hollow eyes and asked a simple question. Would her mommy and daddy come back? Could someone please tell her when they were coming home? The nurse in the video did not answer. What could she say? How do you tell a child that her parents are dead? That they died because some alien species decided human lives did not matter? That they burned alive under a dying star while their daughter escaped without them? Ilara watched the video 3 times. Then she deleted it. She did not need to see it again. That little girl's face was burned into her memory forever. It would be there every time she gave an order, every time she fired a weapon, every time she made a decision that would end lives. Some people said that mercy was the highest virtue, that forgiveness was strength, that revenge was beneath civilized beings. Ilara used to believe that. She used to think that the moral high ground mattered. But the moral high ground had not saved New Terra. Mercy had not protected her brother's children. Forgiveness would not bring back the 890 million dead. The Gentar had made a calculation. They had decided that human lives were acceptable losses. They had broken the one law that kept the galaxy safe because they thought they could get away with it. They thought humanity would negotiate, compromise, eventually forgive. They were wrong. Humanity was done compromising, done negotiating, done forgiving. The Gentar wanted to see what happened when they broke the one law. Now they would find out, and the lesson would be written in fire and blood across their empire. Ilara put on her captain's uniform and walked to the bridge. Her crew was already at their stations. They looked at her with determination and rage and grief. She sat in the command chair and gave her first order. Prepare for departure. Set course for Gentar space. The war was about to begin, and the galaxy would never be the same. The war began at dawn across 30 systems simultaneously. Human fleets emerged from quantum slip space in perfect coordination, appearing in orbit around Gentar military installations like vengeful ghosts. The aliens had expected retaliation, but not this. Not so fast, not so organized, not so ruthless. Ilara watched from the bridge of the Righteous Fury as her fleet surrounded the Gentar shipyard at Calyx 7. The shipyard was massive, a sprawling structure of metal and crystal that produced dozens of warships every month. It was also completely unprepared for an attack. The Gentar had believed their show of force with the stellar weapon would make humanity negotiate. They had not prepared for war. That was their first mistake. The Righteous Fury opened fire. Railguns tore through the shipyard's defenses like paper. Missile swarms overwhelmed their point defense systems. In 17 minutes, the entire facility was reduced to scrap metal and floating debris. Not a single Gentar ship escaped. Not a single weapon platform survived. Across Gentar space, the story was the same. Human fleets struck with surgical precision. They did not target cities. They did not attack civilian populations. They targeted military assets, shipyards, weapons factories, defense stations, command centers. Every piece of Gentar military infrastructure was systematically identified and destroyed. The Gentar tried to fight back. Their fleet scrambled to respond. But the human forces were always one step ahead. They knew where every Gentar ship would be before it got there. They knew which systems were defended and which were vulnerable. They moved like a single organism, coordinated across dozens of light years with impossible precision. This was not just military superiority. This was something the Gentar had not expected, something they did not understand. Humans had spent centuries fighting each other, nation against nation, planet against planet. They had perfected the art of war through blood and suffering and hard-won lessons. They had built systems for logistics, communication, and coordination that no other species could match. The Gentar had never fought a war like this. They were a hive species, They relied on numbers and biological advantages. They could breed soldiers faster than most species could train them. But that meant nothing when their breeding colonies were blockaded and their supply lines were cut. That meant nothing when every ship they built was destroyed before it left the dock. Admiral Okonkwo had promised that humanity would not use stellar weapons. He kept that promise, but he had not promised to be merciful. The human fleets began a new phase of the war, psychological operations. On every Gentar communication channel, on every frequency they used, humanity broadcast the same footage. The death of New Terra, the dying star, the fleeing ships, the bodies left behind. And with that footage came a message. Simple, direct, terrifying. You wanted to see what happens when you break the one law. Now watch what happens when we stop following any laws at all. This is what you bought with 890 million lives. This is what you paid for with your stellar weapon. This is the price of your proportional strike. The message played constantly. The Gentar could not block it. Human hackers had infiltrated their network so thoroughly that shutting down the broadcast would mean shutting down all communication. So the Gentar people watched. They saw what their leaders had done. They saw the cost, and they began to understand that they had made a terrible mistake. By the end of the first week, 30 Gentar military installations had been destroyed. By the end of the first month, the number climbed to over 100. The Gentar Concordat called for peace talks. They offered reparations. They offered to surrender their entire military. They offered anything humanity wanted if the attacks would just stop. Admiral Okonkwo refused. There would be no negotiations, no peace talks, no compromise. The war would continue until the Gentar Concordat was completely dismantled. Every ship, every weapon, every facility, all of it would be destroyed. The galaxy watched in growing fear. Some species began to reconsider their positions. The score quietly stopped sending supplies to the Gentar. The Vesh declared that they had never supported the stellar weapon attack. Even the ancient species, the ones who had been neutral, started making friendly overtures to human diplomats. Everyone was suddenly very interested in being on humanity's good side, but not everyone was convinced. Some species whispered that humanity had gone too far, that this was no longer about justice. It was about revenge, about showing off military power, about terrifying the rest of the galaxy into submission. These critics pointed out that the Gentar were already defeated. Their military was in ruins. Why keep destroying? Why not accept their surrender? The answer came in the form of another broadcast. This time it was not footage of New Terra. It was footage of the Gentar breeding colonies. The systems they had claimed to be protecting when they fired the stellar weapon. The colonies were untouched. Not a single human ship had gone near them. Not a single weapon had been fired at civilian targets. The message that accompanied the footage was clear. Humanity remembered what the Gentar had claimed, that they needed to protect their young, that human expansion threatened their breeding grounds. So humanity had stayed away, not because they could not attack, but because they chose not to. Because even in war, even in rage, humans understood that some lines should not be crossed. They would destroy every Gentar weapon. They would dismantle every military installation. But they would not harm civilians. They would not target children. That was the difference between humanity and the Gentar. The Gentar had killed billions of civilians and called it necessary. Humanity killed only soldiers and called it justice. 3 months into the war, Ilara's fleet cornered a major Gentar battle group near the colony world of Chitrix 9. It was one of the largest engagements of the war, 40 Gentar warships against 20 human vessels. On paper, the Gentar had the advantage. They outnumbered the humans 2-1. But numbers meant nothing in modern warfare. The battle lasted 6 hours. When it ended, 37 Gentar ships were destroyed. The remaining 3 surrendered. The human fleet suffered damage to 5 ships and lost 1 destroyer. The crew of that destroyer evacuated before the ship exploded. Not a single human life was lost. After the battle, Ilara ordered her fleet to establish a quarantine around Chitrix 9. The colony held millions of Gentar civilians. Her orders from Admiral Okonkwo were clear: disarm the population, confiscate all military equipment, ensure no resistance, but leave the civilians alone. Ilara sat in her command chair and stared at the planet below. Part of her, the part that still remembered her brother's face, wanted to do more, wanted to make the Gentar people feel what she felt. wanted them to understand loss and grief and helpless rage. It would be so easy. A few orbital strikes, a blockade of food and medicine, make them suffer the way New Terra had suffered. But she did not give that order. Instead, she authorized humanitarian aid, medical supplies for the civilians, food for the children, because that was what separated humans from the Gentar. Humans could be ruthless in war. They could be efficient killers. They could destroy entire fleets without hesitation, but they did not target the innocent. They did not make children pay for the crimes of their leaders. That night, Alara received a message from one of the Gentar prisoners, a ship captain who had survived the battle. The message was simple. He said he understood now, understood why humanity was so angry, understood why the war would not end until the Concordat was completely destroyed. His people had thought humans were weak because they valued individual lives. They had thought mercy was weakness. They had been wrong. Humans were not weak. They were controlled, disciplined, capable of holding back their full power even when every instinct screamed for revenge. The Gentar had mistaken that control for weakness. They had poked what they thought was a sleeping prey animal. Instead, they had awakened a predator that had spent centuries learning how to kill efficiently. The war entered its 4th month. 47 Gentar systems had fallen. Their Concordat was fracturing. Some factions wanted to keep fighting. Others wanted to surrender immediately. Still others wanted to activate more stellar weapons to take as many humans with them as possible. But Admiral Okonkwo had prepared for this. Human intelligence had spent months mapping every Gentar facility. They knew where the stellar weapons were hidden. They knew which scientists had worked on them. They knew everything, and they had already sent special forces teams to neutralize every single weapon. The Gentar discovered this when they tried to activate their backup stellar lance. The weapon did not fire. Instead, it exploded, destroying the research station and everyone in it. The same thing happened at 3 other facilities. The message was clear. Humanity had already won. The Gentar just had not admitted it yet. Alara looked at the tactical displays and felt nothing. No satisfaction, no joy. Just emptiness. The Gentar were broken. Their military was in ruins. Their government was collapsing. But her brother was still dead. His children were still gone. 890 million people were still lost forever. Victory did not bring them back. It just meant the killing could finally stop. 8 months. The war had been going on for 8 months, and the Gentar Concordat was dying. Not quickly like New Terra had died, but slowly, painfully, system by system, installation by installation. Every day brought news of another defeat. Another fleet destroyed. Another world quarantined and disarmed. The Gentar government had fractured completely. 3 separate factions now claimed leadership. One wanted immediate surrender. Another wanted to fight to the last soldier. The third, the most desperate, wanted to activate every stellar weapon they had left and take the entire galaxy down with them. They sent encrypted messages to their hidden facilities. Messages that human intelligence intercepted within minutes. The humans had known about the second stellar weapon for months. It was hidden in a research station disguised as a mining facility, deep in Gentar core territory. The weapon was aimed at Earth itself. A revenge strike. If the Gentar were going to fall, they would take humanity's homeworld with them. At least that was their plan. But the plan had a fatal flaw. The humans had known about it all along. Admiral Okonkwo had left it alone deliberately. Let the Gentar think they had one final card to play, one last way to strike back. It made them predictable. Desperate enemies did desperate things, and desperate things could be anticipated. When the Gentar scientists tried to activate the stellar weapon, nothing happened. The weapon did not fire. The systems did not respond. Confused technicians ran diagnostics and found something horrifying. The weapon's core systems had been replaced with fakes months ago. Human special forces had infiltrated the facility, swapped out critical components, and left without anyone noticing. The weapon was just a very expensive piece of worthless metal. The moment the Gentar tried to activate the weapon, human forces knew. It was the signal they had been waiting for. The trap was sprung. The entire human First Fleet, over 300 ships, emerged from quantum slipspace directly around the Gentar homeworld of Gentaris. The planet's orbital defenses opened fire immediately, but they were already outmatched. The human fleet had them surrounded, outgunned, outmaneuvered. Ilara stood on the bridge of the Righteous Fury and watched the battle unfold on the tactical displays. Her ship was at the center of the formation, leading the assault. Around her, hundreds of other ships moved in perfect coordination. They destroyed defense platforms, disabled orbital weapons, cleared paths for the assault forces. The battle was brief. The Gentar had no chance. Their best ships had already been destroyed in earlier engagements. Their most experienced commanders were dead or captured. What remained was a desperate defense by undertrained crews in outdated vessels. In 4 hours, the orbital defenses were silent. The Gentar homeworld was defenseless. Admiral Okonkwo sent a message to the Gentar leadership. Simple and direct. Surrender now or face complete annihilation. Every military facility on the planet would be destroyed from orbit. Every ship in the system would be disabled. There would be no negotiation. No conditions. Just surrender or die. The Gentar Hive Queen did not respond. For 6 hours there was silence. Then the orbital defense network powered up again. Not to fire at the human fleet, but to self-destruct. The Gentar were destroying their own weapons rather than hand them over. It was a final act of defiance. Pointless and petty, but defiance nonetheless. Ilara received new orders. Send boarding parties to the royal palace. Capture the Hive Queen and her command council. Bring them out alive if possible. Dead if necessary. But bring them out. The human fleet needed this war to end, and it would not end until the Gentar leadership faced justice. Ilara led the boarding party herself. She took a dropship down to the planet's surface with 200 Marines. The royal palace was a massive structure of crystal and chitin, built in the center of the capital city. It was supposed to be impregnable, protected by the best soldiers in the Gentar military, but the best soldiers were already dead. What remained were scared conscripts who barely knew which end of a weapon to point. The Marines moved through the palace like ghosts. They had trained for this, practiced it hundreds of times in simulations. They knew the layout. They knew where the guards would be. They knew which doors were trapped and which corridors were safe. The Gentar defenders tried to fight back, but it was hopeless. Human soldiers had better armor, better weapons, better training. In 20 minutes, the palace was secured. Ilara found the Hive Queen in the throne room. The queen was enormous, 3 times the size of a normal Gentar, with a shell that gleamed like polished obsidian. She sat on her throne and watched the human soldiers enter with compound eyes that showed no fear. Around her stood the last of her royal guard, weapons raised but not firing. They knew they were beaten. They just did not know if they should die fighting or live in shame. The queen spoke first. Her translator device turned her clicking mandibles into smooth words. She said she would not beg for mercy. She had done what she believed was necessary to protect her people. If humanity wanted revenge, they could take it. She would die with dignity. Ilara stepped forward. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times. Imagined what she would say to the creature responsible for her brother's death. For the deaths of 890 million humans. She had imagined pulling the trigger, watching the queen die, feeling some sense of justice or closure or satisfaction. But standing there looking at the queen, Ilara felt nothing. No rage, no hatred, just emptiness. Killing this creature would not bring anyone back. It would not undo the damage. It would not heal the wounds. It would just add one more death to a war that had already cost too many lives. She told the queen that humanity did not want revenge. They wanted justice. Real justice. The kind that came from courts and trials and the rule of law. The queen would face the Galactic Council. She would answer for her crimes in front of the entire galaxy. She would be judged not by her enemies, but by neutral observers who would weigh the evidence and deliver a fair verdict. The queen laughed. It was a horrible sound, like rocks grinding together. She said the Galactic Council was weak. They would never convict her. They were too afraid of setting precedents, too worried about offending other species. They would give her a light sentence or let her claim cultural immunity. Justice was a fantasy humans told themselves to sleep better at night. Ilara lowered her weapon. She told the queen that maybe she was right. Maybe the council would be too weak to deliver real justice. But that was not humanity's problem anymore. Humanity had done its part. They had dismantled the Gentar military. They had captured the guilty parties. Now it was time to let the galaxy decide what justice meant. If the council failed, that would be on them, not on humanity. The queen stared at her with those alien compound eyes. She said she did not understand. Humans had won. They could do whatever they wanted. Why hand her over to a council that might let her go free? Why not just execute her and be done with it? Ilara's answer was simple. Because that was what separated humans from the Gentar. The Gentar had broken the law when it suited them. They had killed billions because it was convenient, because it solved a short-term problem. Humans had laws too. Laws that said even in war, even in grief, even in rage, some lines must not be crossed. Extrajudicial executions were one of those lines. The Queen was arrested along with her entire command council. They were transported to a secure facility to await trial. The Gentar people watched as their leaders were taken away in chains. Some were angry. Some were relieved. Most were just exhausted. The war had cost them everything. Their military was destroyed. Their economy was in ruins. Their empire was broken. And for what? For a proportional strike that had accomplished nothing except to awaken human fury. That night, Ilara sat in her quarters on the Righteous Fury and composed a message to Admiral Okonkwo. She told him that she had captured the Queen as ordered. But she had not executed her. She had chosen to follow the law instead of her orders. She expected to be court-martialed. She expected to lose her command. She did not care. She had seen enough death. She had ordered enough destruction. She needed to believe that humanity was better than its enemies. That meant following rules even when rules were inconvenient. The Admiral's response came 6 hours later. He was furious. He called her insubordinate. He called her naive. He called her a traitor to the memory of everyone who died on New Terra. But he did not remove her from command. Instead, he ordered her back to Earth. The war was over. The Gentar were defeated. Now came the hard part, figuring out what came next. Ilara looked out at the stars and wondered if she had made the right choice. The Queen deserved to die. Of that, there was no doubt. But did Ilara have the right to be judge, jury, and executioner? Did anyone? The Gentar had thought they did. They had decided that human lives were expendable. They had played at being gods and paid the price. Humanity had won the war. But at what cost? They had become the thing they feared most. The strongest military power in the galaxy. The species everyone else was afraid of. The ones who could destroy entire civilizations when provoked. Power like that was dangerous. It corrupted. It made people think they were justified in anything. The Galactic Council convened on neutral ground. Not on any species' homeworld, but on an ancient space station that had been built by a civilization long dead. The station was called the Threshold, and it floated in empty space between galaxies. It was the perfect place for a trial that would determine the future of galactic law. Representatives from 43 species filled the observation galleries. They came from every corner of known space. Some supported humanity. Others sympathized with the Gentar. Most were just afraid. Afraid of what this trial meant. Afraid of the precedent it would set. Afraid of what would happen if they chose the wrong side. The Gentar Hive Queen and her command council were brought into the chamber in restraints. They looked smaller somehow. Diminished. Without their empire and their armies, they were just insects in chains. The Queen's compound eyes scanned the crowd, searching for allies. She found none. Even the species that had quietly supported the Gentar during the war now pretended they had always stood with humanity. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Prosecutors presented evidence of the Gentar conspiracy. They showed how the stellar weapon had been built over decades in secret. They displayed communication records proving the Hive Queen had personally authorized the attack. They presented testimony from Gentar scientists who had worked on the weapon, soldiers who had guarded the facilities, diplomats who had kept humanity distracted while the weapon charged. The evidence was overwhelming. Undeniable. The Gentar had broken the one law that held galactic civilization together. They had murdered 890 million beings. They had threatened the existence of an entire species. And they had done it all while claiming it was defensive, necessary, proportional. But some species still argued for leniency. The crystalline Vesh pointed out that the Gentar had legitimate concerns about human expansion. The gaseous Eric suggested that perhaps the law against stellar weapons was too harsh. After all, species had the right to defend themselves. The reptilian score said that executing or imprisoning the Gentar leadership would only create martyrs and prolong the conflict. Then it was Ilara's turn to testify. She walked to the witness stand in her dress uniform. Medal she did not remember earning pinned to her chest. She had been promoted to admiral after the war ended. It felt hollow. She would trade every rank and medal to have her brother back. Ilara described the day New Terra died. Not in military terms or statistics, but in human terms. She talked about her brother, about his children, about the little girl in the hospital who asked when her parents were coming home. She described watching the sun explode while millions of people waited to die. She talked about the refugee camps, about the orphans, about the survivors who would spend the rest of their lives looking at the sky and remembering. When she finished, the chamber was silent. Even the species that had argued for leniency looked uncomfortable. It was easy to debate legal theory and geopolitical strategy. It was harder to ignore the human cost, the actual lives that had been destroyed. The defense tried to argue that the Hive Queen had acted to protect her species, that she had believed the threat from humanity was real and immediate, that she had made a difficult choice in impossible circumstances. But the prosecution destroyed that argument easily. The Gentar had never attempted real diplomacy. They had never presented their concerns to the Galactic Council. They had never asked for mediation or arbitration. They had just built a weapon in secret and used it to commit mass murder. After 3 weeks of testimony, the council deliberated for 2 days. When they returned, the chamber fell silent. The verdict was unanimous, guilty on all charges. The Gentar Hive Queen and her command council were convicted of crimes against civilization. The Gentar Concordat was officially dissolved. All Gentar worlds would be placed under Galactic Council administration for 3 generations. The species would be allowed to govern themselves again only after they had proven they understood the responsibility that came with interstellar civilization. The Hive Queen and her conspirators were sentenced to life imprisonment, not execution, not exile, prison. They would spend the rest of their lives in a secure facility thinking about what they had done, thinking about the 890 million lives they had ended because they were afraid of a threat that might have existed someday. Humanity accepted the verdict. Admiral Okonkwo did not. He held a press conference the day after the sentencing and announced his resignation. He said the council had been too lenient, that life imprisonment was not enough for genocide, that the Gentar should have been executed, and their worlds turned into monuments to their crimes. He said he could no longer serve an empire that valued galactic diplomacy over justice for its own people. The admiral's resignation shocked the human empire. He had been a hero, the man who had led humanity to victory, the man who had dismantled an entire alien civilization in 8 months. But now he walked away because he disagreed with how the victory ended. Some people called him principled. Others called him bitter. Ilara thought he was just tired. Tired of war. Tired of death. Tired of trying to find justice in a galaxy that did not understand what the word meant. In the aftermath of the trial, humanity withdrew from the Galactic Council. Not completely. They still maintained diplomatic relations, still traded with other species, but they no longer participated in council governance. They no longer trusted other species to protect human interests. The war had taught them a hard lesson. When trouble came, humanity stood alone. The human government implemented what came to be called the Okonkwo Doctrine. Any attack on human worlds would result in total military response. Proportionality was no longer a consideration. If you struck at humanity, humanity would strike back with everything it had. There would be no negotiation, no compromise, no mercy. The galaxy would never again mistake human restraint for weakness. Ilara was given command of the Frontier Defense Fleet. Her job was to patrol the borders of human space and ensure no one else decided to test humanity's resolve. It was a strange existence, preparing for wars that might never come, training for battles that everyone hoped to avoid. But someone had to do it. Someone had to stand watch and make sure the galaxy remembered the lesson of the Gentar. She visited the New Terra Memorial whenever she returned to Earth. The memorial was built on New Mars, a world that had been empty before the war but now housed millions of refugees. The memorial was simple, a wall of names, 890 million of them, engraved in stone that would last for millennia. Each name representing a life cut short, a future stolen. A family destroyed. Ilara found her brother's name and the names of his family. She traced the letters with her fingers and tried to remember what they sounded like when they laughed. It was getting harder. Time dulled everything, even grief. Sometimes she wondered if that was worse than the grief itself. The knowledge that eventually she would forget. That her brother would become just another name on a wall. A young ensign approached her at the memorial one day. The girl could not have been more than 20. She asked if Ilara was the Admiral Voss who had captured the Hive Queen. Ilara confirmed that she was. The girl said thank you. Her parents had died on New Terra. She had been at school on another world when it happened. She said knowing the people responsible were in prison helped. It did not bring her parents back, but it helped. Ilara asked the girl why she had joined the military. The answer was simple: to make sure it never happened again, to stand guard so other children did not lose their parents to alien weapons, to be part of the wall that protected humanity from a galaxy that had proven it could not be trusted. That was the legacy of the war. An entire generation that had learned the galaxy was dangerous, that peace was fragile, that the only security came from strength. The optimism that had characterized early human expansion into the stars was gone. In its place was caution, vigilance, and a willingness to fight that frightened even humanity's allies. Across the galaxy, other species watched and learned. The Gentar became a cautionary tale, a warning that was taught to every young alien entering diplomatic service. Never break the one law, never threaten extinction, and never ever assume you understand humanity well enough to predict their response. Because humanity had proven something during the war, something that terrified most species and reassured only a few. Humans could be kind. They could be merciful. They could show restraint even in the face of unimaginable loss. But when you pushed them past that point, when you broke the rules that held civilization together, humanity would show you why they had climbed to the top of the food chain on their violent little world. A century passed. The war became history. The survivors grew old and died. New generations were born who knew about New Terra only from textbooks and documentaries. The refugee camps became permanent settlements. The orphans grew up and had children of their own. Life continued as life always did. But the galaxy did not forget. On every world and every culture, young beings learned about the one law. The law that must never be broken, and they learned about the species that enforced it. Not through councils or committees or diplomatic pressure, but through the simple, terrifying promise that if you broke the law, humanity would break you.